Yeah. Welcome to the Into the Wilderness podcast. I'm your host, Byron Pace. It is the 16th of April, 2020. We are back with the usual long-form interview-based podcast that we always bring you. But as our regular listeners will know, in the last couple of weeks, I've introduced some shorts. Into the Wilderness Shorts is the tag that you need to look for if you're looking down your list of Into the Wilderness podcasts. Tell me what you think. Are you enjoying them? A couple of you have already let us know. It's all been positive so far, but as always, I love to hear your feedback. Before I get into what this show is on, a massive shout out to our Patreon supporters. We've had some new patrons in the last couple of weeks. Thank you to every single one of you. But this week's top tier supporters include Richard Stevens, Richard McNeil, Ronnie Speakman, Chris Griffith, John Henry Pete, Tom McCraith, James Benjamin Normandale, James Marchington, the guys at South Ayrshire Stalking, Josh Starling, Sean Rowan, and our newest top tier, James Alban Corbin. Thank you very much to every single one of you and all of our Patreon supporters. It really, really makes a difference to be able to bring these shows. And it's really because of Patreon supporters that I've been able to carve out some time and put out these extra short shows. So once again, thank you very much. This show is all about lead toxicity and its use in particular in ammunition. It's a really complicated topic and one which I wish I could have covered a couple of weeks back when it was all across the news and papers and radio programs in the UK. But the problem with rushing interviews like that is that you tend to only get half the story. So I pulled conversations and research from around the globe to put together what I hope is one of the most comprehensive debates on lead yet. I'll introduce each person throughout, but you'll be hearing from Dan Reynolds from the British Association for Shooting and Conservation, Roy Lupton, who's a falconer and field sports advocate, David CP, my good buddy from over in Denmark, who runs a hunting school and is a well-known voice of educated reason in the hunting community. You'll also hear from Diggory Haddoke, who is a vintage gun dealer and a previous guest on the show, as well as an extract from BBC Science Today, where they also discuss the topic. And of course, we need our own science in this podcast to really get to the guts of what lead is all about. So for that, I got hold of avian specialist vet Tom Dutton. We have an incredibly wide array of guests, and I hope that I've managed to put it together in a way that people can follow and understand. It has been by far the most time-consuming podcast I have ever done, and I really hope that it's worth it. So let me know what you think. Quick note, Northern Shooting Show has changed their date, unsurprisingly, with the current lockdown. I'll bring you more information as we get closer, but right now it's going to be held on the 28th and 29th of August at the Yorkshire Showground. Visit northernshootingshow.co.uk for more information. Competition time, as we always do every 2 weeks. I have a winner. I asked you 2 weeks ago to leave us a review for the chance to win a copy of Modern Huntsman. I was even going to let you pick what volume you wanted because we are reprinting some of the back issues which were no longer available. We had so many amazing reviews. Thank you so much to all of you who took the time because it really makes a difference for other people being able to find the podcast. But the winner that I picked is at Sea River Hill on Apple Podcasts. So congratulations, Sea River Hill. Give me a shout on email or social, and I will get a copy of Modern Huntsman out to you. I thought I might just read your review. I hope that's okay. It's in the public domain anyway. Sea River Hill says, hands down my favorite podcast. Thank you very much. The Pace Brothers cover a huge range of topics in an informed, educational, and honest way. A great mixture of science, conservation, adventure, and hunting combined with some incredible guests. Highly recommended. Of course, it is really our guests who make this podcast, but thank you very, very much. 2 weeks ago, I let all of our podcast listeners know about a discount code, Into the Wilderness. The discount code is Into the Wilderness, same name as the podcast. You can use it on our website, thepacebrothers.com, and it will give you 15% off anything related to Modern Huntsman on the shop. Amazing deal. You guys are amazing, so that's why we've managed to do that. Into the Wilderness is the discount code. Just use it in checkout. This week for the competition, to win a copy of Modern Huntsman. Again, whatever volume you want, even the volume that's not out yet, volume 5, which we're just putting together now. All I would like is a share of the podcast on social media. So I always put out a post on Twitter and on Instagram, either through stories or a post, and on Facebook as well. So just share that. And all the people who share it, I will stick you into the random number generator and pick a name out of the hat to win a copy. On Twitter, you will find the podcast at Byron J. Pace, which is exactly the same on Instagram, at Byron J. Pace. And if you're using Facebook, if you're not on my personal Facebook, then at Pace Brothers Film. I've been trying to migrate the page. We had 2 pages on Facebook. One for the Pace Brothers Film and then one just for the podcast. The podcast one's still going to stay there, but it's just far too much work to manage all these pages. So I'm trying to put all of the podcast stuff on at Pace Brothers Film as well. So I will hold you up no longer. We're going to jump straight into the show. I hope you like it. Roy, welcome back to the Into the Wilderness podcast. You've been a guest on here before, but we were in person last time, and this time we are recording from quite literally the other sides of the planet from one another in very weird times. Are you completely locked down in your house?
Yeah, we are. I mean, we're still getting out and in the evening and just doing a little bit of shooting because we've still got a little bit of fox control to do and a little bit of rat control to do. But apart from that, everything is pretty much shut down. So yeah, the UK at the moment is grinding to a halt as we speak, and I think you've got some bits starting over there in the States as well, which look like it could get interesting for your travel home. By the look of it.
But you're a hunter, so you must have a freezer full of meat. The only problem is you might run out of bog roll.
We're already there, so yeah, we've got the sponges ready. We just got to go out and find the sticks. So yeah, it is getting ridiculous. I mean, everybody has been out hunting for toilet roll. So
wow. Okay. Well, we're not here to talk about.
I'm not quick enough to get in there. Huh?
We're not here to talk about hunting for toilet roll today. We're here to talk about lead of all things. Now, in the weeks prior to the chaos that is coronavirus, the major UK hunting organizations came out with a recommendation that we have a concerted shift away from lead within the next 5 years. Now, I'm using the word shift because it is not a ban that they've called for, but basically they would like to see our community completely moving away from lead, mainly so that we are not forced, because even those people who are maybe against this change would probably accept at some point in the future this is something that is going to happen. This is the direction that Europe is taking, and the rest of the world, in fact. And even though we're now out of Europe, I think there is a momentum in that direction with the science and understanding that we have now that means that we're going to be continuing to phase out lead in our lifestyles, just as we have done historically with lead pipes. Okay, before I get to the question I was going to ask Roy, let me lay the background out a little more. Here is Dan Reynolds talking to me just a few days after the lead phasing out announcement.
An interesting few days. So announcement went out on Monday, and that is a joint announcement across 9 shooting organisations. And basically, as you're absolutely right, it's calling from a voluntary transition away from the use of lead shot and single-use plastic in live quarry shooting over the course of the next 5 years. Why have we got to this position now? A combination of factors. There is obviously a good deal of data around lead and the impacts of lead on the environment, human health, etc., which evidence is certainly mounting and growing. And you've also got, as we stand here now, some really good changes in terms of ammunition and ammunition product availability. So we are in a position now where we have got the availability of non-lead ammunition, so tungsten, steel, bismuth, but actually having a cost-viable alternative in steel, which doesn't contain a plastic wad. So you've got an eco wad, bio wad, whichever you want to call them. There are various products now on the market. So it allows us to use a non-lead ammunition without using a plastic wad, and single-use plastic is probably one of the single biggest issues in terms of sort of the public consciousness at this point in time. So moving away from those things, we are in a situation where A, the evidence is mounting, B, that there are unavailability of products, and C, and I think the other thing to note that is very important is that over the course of the last 10 years or so, the European Chemicals Agency, which have oversight of restricted or listed chemicals across Europe, have gone to and fro with the European Commission, looking at lead shot and the use of lead shot or lead in a variety of products. And they are now looking again at lead in ammunition, and the ECHA, European Chemicals Agency, are looking at lead in all types of ammunition. They have gone to European Commission and basically said, look, we believe that there are these risks associated with lead shot in ammunition, and they're also looking at in the various sort of fishing tackle products as well. And the European Commission have gone back to them and said, okay, we understand you've identified that these risks, so we now require you to produce a restriction dossier. European Chemicals Agency are in the process of putting that together. That restriction dossier will be put in place in October, and then we end up, if you look at the European Commission's timetables, we will basically end up in a situation whereby that restriction system will be put in place from 2022. Now, many of the listeners may be sitting there thinking, well,
we're not in Europe anymore.
We've left the EU, so why would that matter?
Yeah.
Well, it matters for two reasons. One is that primarily there is nothing stopping the adoption of those EU legislative principles coming across to the UK. So we could be placed in a situation in 2022 whereby our government seek to place and I'm not preempting what that restriction dossier might say, but it might be an entire ban on all lead ammunition, which they might seek to phase in and put into UK law from Europe. Even if they don't do that, and if the restriction dossier is there is a ban on lead shot in hunting in Europe, and obviously the associated production of game meat products, we're in a bit of a tricky situation because 50% plus of our game meat shot in this country, so I'm talking pheasants and partridges, is exported to continental Europe. The problem that presents is that if we are shooting things with lead, how do we export that product to Europe when they won't accept it? We then have an issue with an oversupply of game, which we have no market for, and that in turn has a knock-on effect to the game shooting industry, for want of a better term, and obviously that then has knock-on implications for rural economies, rural communities, and all the rest of it.
With the groundwork done, let's get back to Roy Lupton and focus more on the impact of lead on wildlife, because much of the discussion that has been had has been with regard to human consumption and then the economics and viability of us actually being able to switch from lead to steel. But I don't think there's been enough discussion about the implications on wildlife. Now, we know in the UK that, or I would hope that we have a certain understanding that lead has impacted particularly wildfowl because we have laws and regulations in place that restrict the use of lead over waterways or for certain species. But you not only hunt, you also keep birds of prey. So maybe you could expand on that a little bit and explain how the toxicity works and how important it is to keep lead out of the system of raptors in particular.
Certainly, I will give it my best. I mean, obviously, we spoke a little while ago with Chris Parrish from the Peregrine Fund, who's heading up one of the sides of the condor programs, and they're recapturing condors and treating them for lead every year. And with that, we were getting some scary statistics. And when we were speaking about it, it was quite interesting because when we actually put that out, everybody really sort of jumped on it, or everybody from the UK that's pro shooting, and obviously I'm from a shooting and hunting background, and I'm as pro shooting as you can get. But there was a lot of upset people because they see that we're giving something away. And I think, that's what we need to sort of get our heads around, that we're not giving it away. We're just trying to shift, and we're trying to accommodate and really improve our status as people that have got a vested interest in the countryside and the wildlife within it. And I think that's where people are missing the trick, because we do pride ourselves within the shooting communities as being stewards of the countryside, and of being able to conserve. And obviously there's been some massive conservation efforts throughout history that have been formulated and started by the hunting communities and certain individuals within hunting. And I don't think that changes anywhere from today. I mean, we need to be at the forefront of looking after the wildlife that we've got. And if there are options out there that allow us to have a cleaner outlook, that allow us to shift away from something that is, at the end of the day, a toxic substance, then we've got the ability to do it. We've got the time to do it, and I think really 5 years is plenty of time. And I really think that we should be embracing it with open arms, because we do see, with, as you say, with a lot of wildfowl and with a lot of raptors, that obviously the ingestion of lead does cause immense problems with them. And I think one of the major things that cropped up when I was talking with Chris Parrish, when we were discussing lead with him, from the public comments were, well, you're not seeing hundreds of birds of prey laying dead everywhere. They're not dropping off their perches. And unfortunately, it's not as simple as that. There is, with the lead ingestion, it's not just a case that it proves fatal with everything that ingests it. It depends at how much they ingest, how it affects them. Again, the sort of it can affect them in slightly individual ways depending on the species as well. But as I say, it's not just a case of fatalities. It's a case that if you're exposing the animals to lead, they've got that lead running through their blood system, they will be depositing it as calcium within their bones as well, which can then, when they require calcium to lay eggs, they use that lead stored in their bones to create their eggs. So, and then obviously, we've got issues with soft-shelled eggs or eggs that are not properly formed, and then again, what harm is that then causing to the embryos inside as well?
You might not be seeing physically dead birds, but their ability to recruit new birds into the population diminishes.
And it's not. I mean, it's not just recruitment. You're affecting how those birds are performing in the wild. So, birds of prey generally have a 70% attrition rate in their first year, because it's a hard old world out there, and by them ingesting small amounts of lead, then that will also, or could also affect their survivability, the possibilities of them being able to make it through the winters. If they've only got to be a small percentage of their top performance, and that will have a massive effect.
So as somebody who keeps birds of prey, you're feeding them meat all the time. How concerned are you about lead? Because I think that should be a fairly telling question as to the potential impact on these birds. If I ask that to someone who cares deeply about those animals in your care.
Again, I think it's something, for me, I will not feed anything that has been shot anymore. I will not use any shot pigeons. I won't use any rabbits or anything like that, even down to the extent that if I catch rabbits with my hawks, or I catch hares, or I catch pheasants, I won't actually allow the birds to feed up on any of the flesh of those. I will allow them to have the pluck so they can have the heart and lungs, because obviously if the shot or if the lead has got through to those parts of an animal or bird, then it would prove pretty fatal for that animal, and then we wouldn't be catching it with a hawk. But as I say, I will not allow them to eat any flesh, because purely for the fact that if that bird has been pricked, and that then a few weeks later I fly it with a hawk and catch it, then there could still be a couple of number 6 or number 5 shot in there. And if I feed up on those, then that could create problems for my hawks further down the line, which has actually happened. I have had problems in the past where birds have eaten a prey item that I've caught. And lots of my friends have had the same as well, and it's had massive detrimental effects on some birds and even killed others.
So, what do you actually see, Roy? I mean, it must be a pretty hard thing to watch, because you're with these birds all the time. So, what physically do you notice happening, and do you have any idea how much lead would have been ingested by these birds? Are we talking about very small quantities?
Incredibly small. Certain birds are more susceptible to digesting and absorbing the lead than others. Generally, eagles, condors, and things like that tend to be more efficient at dissolving the lead, and therefore they're more at risk. Some of the falcons can, and I know for many years people used to feed shot pigeons to their peregrines. And it would give me the shivers to do that now, but they used to get away with it time after time because obviously their digestive system is not as effective as absorbing it. But so it can depend on the bird, but just because it hasn't affected them from a physical standpoint that we can see doesn't necessarily mean, as we just discussed, that it's not affecting them on a deeper level. And some of the things you do see with birds of prey when they are affected with lead is you'll see very pale mucous membranes. Then you can start to see them going off their legs a little bit. They'll sort of sit down on their hocks a bit. And then in the later stages, you'll see them stargazing. So you'll see them, kicking up their head and looking back when it's progressing into their system. And as I say, it can be literally one shot or a fragment of a bullet. So again, it's phenomenal how many or how far the lead will travel from a frangible rifle bullet when you shoot a deer or you shoot a rabbit or anything like that. So again, I've stopped feeding any carcasses that we're shooting to any of my birds. We eat it, but I will not feed it to the birds just because you're always running the risk of a slight fragment of lead getting through.
This story has not just been confined to the shooting press, however. Here's Professor Debbie Payne from Cambridge University speaking on BBC Science Today with Adam Rutherford, explaining how lead affects birds.
And birds, like wildfowl, so ducks, swans and geese, but also a lot of terrestrial birds, will ingest those spent lead gunshot from the environment, thinking that they're either grit or food. And those birds ingest grit. It's retained in a very muscular part of their stomach called the gizzard, and it's used to help grind up food because they don't have teeth. So the lead is ground up, dissolved and absorbed into the bloodstream. And you then get very elevated lead concentrations, and that's estimated to kill about 75,000 wildfowl in the UK every year and cause considerable suffering for about 3 times that. So for birds, it's a much bigger problem in terms of the exposure that they get and the effects than it is for humans, where we're exposed to much lower levels and the effects tend to be sublethal and very, minor compared to the mortality that we get in birds.
I wanted to dig into the science and chemistry a little bit more for myself, so I tracked down Tom Dutton, an avian specialist vet. I think the best place to start this conversation is to help me, but also the listeners, understand how lead toxicity works and why is it a problem? How does it affect animals?
So certainly from what I see, mainly treating birds, both wild and captive, and birds certainly seem to be more susceptible to lead toxicity than mammals. First of all, they've got to ingest it. And certain birds are more likely to come into contact with lead than other species. So particularly waterfowl, which I think everyone's fairly aware of, because they ingest lead or lead particles, thinking it's grit, which is an important part of their digestion. But then also the the raptors and the scavenging birds who ingest lead as part of their normal diet if they scavenge on carcasses that are contaminated. So then the lead gets absorbed, and that happens from the digestive tract, and the amount of lead being absorbed really depends in what form it's in, the size of the particles, and the acidity of the stomach. And then once it's in the bloodstream, it goes to all the different tissues in the body where lead can have an effect. And lead is particularly toxic as an organism because it can have an effect on so many different body tissues. So from the blood, preventing normal hemoglobin formation, and hemoglobin is really important in carrying oxygen, to issues in the nervous system in particular, with the immune system, reproduction, the list goes on and on.
What would be good is if we can build an understanding of the digestion in different birds. So you mentioned waterfowl there. Maybe just expand on that a little bit, because the way that they digest their food, it passes through a gizzard which grinds up whatever it is that they've intaken.
Absolutely. So they've got a very specialized digestive system. So most birds that eat predominantly grain, seed type food, plant-based matter, to break that down effectively and to allow them to digest it, they've got to grind it up. So they've got two parts to their stomach. They've got the first part, which is what we term a proventriculus, which secretes enzymes a bit like our stomach, and then they've got this second part which is fairly unique called a gizzard or a ventriculus, and that's really muscular, powerful stomach. And to help with the grinding, they ingest grit, which creates a rough surface within that muscular stomach to then grind their food up into smaller particles. And I think a lot of people will understand that if something's smaller, it absorbs more effectively and more efficiently. And so they end up ingesting. So they naturally pick up grit throughout their life. And when they're scavenging and picking up this grit material, either from the mud, bottom of water courses, then they end up accidentally picking up any lead particles that may be in there.
Okay, so I think that's fairly easy to understand. People can imagine someone shooting on the foreshore over waterways, and this spraying of shotgun pellets, which should be at some sort of intended quarry. All of those pellets, if you do indeed hit what you're shooting at, won't be in the body of the animal that you've been targeting, and so they fall to the ground. And this is how certain species, like waterfowl, are picking them up. What about in raptors? Obviously, raptors are a protected species, so no one should be shooting at them. So how are they picking up lead from other animals? This is a secondary poisoning.
It depends on the species of raptor. So the raptor species that are most susceptible to lead toxicity are ones that have scavenging as part of their diet. So in the UK, that's going to be particularly your kites, your buzzards, your eagles, but not exclusively, but particularly those species have more scavenging as part of their feeding strategies. So they will come across either wounded animals that may have been non-fatally shot, which obviously occurs occasionally, or they may come across dead carcasses that still have shot, or may come across gralloch material that's containing shot, and then it gets ingested. So they will feed on that opportunistically, and then they'll ingest either lead shot if it's from shotgun shot prey, or potentially bullet fragments if it was from rifle shot prey.
And are some birds more susceptible to lead poisoning than others?
Well, there's a thought that certainly eagles and vultures seem to be overrepresented, and that's certainly partly because of their feeding strategies, but also there is certainly one theory that because they eat a lot of dead prey, because they scavenge, they have a very acidic stomach, which allows them to cope with potentially ingesting food that's got a higher bacterial content, and with a more acidic stomach, they will therefore digest and dissolve the lead more quickly than a raptor species like an owl, which has a slightly less acidic stomach.
Okay, so the theory and the science that we understand when it comes to lead ingestion is there. But what's the reality on the ground? It's all fine us talking about, well, this would be a terrible thing if it happens, but what evidence actually exists that in the real world it's a problem, and it's a problem because of lead propelled into the environment from the activity of shooting?
Yeah, so there's quite a few different research projects worldwide looking into this. So in the UK, there's been a number of studies in red kites, which have shown that when you're looking at red kite wildlife casualties, so these are birds that have been brought into rehab centres, veterinary facilities, injured or sick, that when they've tested those birds, 1 in 7 in one of the most recent studies had elevated lead levels that would lead to toxicity, and that actually 35% had lead levels that were increased compared to what would be normal. So these may not be toxic levels of lead at this stage, but that's 1 in 3 birds actually had an increased exposure to lead beyond what would be background levels. And when they've looked under nest sites of red kites, and they have analysed the castings, so the castings are the non-digestible items of prey which are ejected, 2% of those castings contained lead material and lead shot most commonly. So that shows that one of our own domestic raptor species is really heavily affected. And then when you go out of the UK, there's been some really good research in Europe, particularly in Swiss Alps, where they were looking at golden eagles that presented with injuries. A lot of those were things like pylon strikes or other traumatic injuries, a couple of birds that were illegally poisoned, and they looked at those lead levels, and 14 out of 46 birds had lead levels which were consistent with toxicosis, so high lead levels. And what's very interesting, these birds that have high lead levels, even if it's a sublethal level, they're going to be more likely to suffer other injuries and illness, such as things like pylon strikes or flying into wind turbines, these sorts of injuries, because of nervous effects that the lead has on their body.
Oh, interesting. So the neurological damage that the lead is doing as a result of the toxicity burden is affecting them in the ways that they potentially will come into other types of harm which may kill them.
Exactly, because it'll affect their immune system, but it'll also affect their avoidance when flying, and yeah, they're just going to be more susceptible to injury and illness because of sublethal lead toxicities. I think from my point of view, I work in one part of the UK, and just in my hospital, I see cases month by month where we are treating lead toxicity in both wild and captive birds. And with the captive birds, that's captive-owned falconry birds. And so it's not just something that happens on paper. It's not just something that scientists say can happen. This is something that's real and something that we treat on a regular basis. And for me, these are needless wildlife casualties. These things shouldn't be happening. They're completely avoidable by not using lead ammunition. And if there are viable alternatives, then we should be using them.
We will expand on this a little later, but I was keen to get Tom's opinion on the use of lead rifle ammunition and understand why he thinks that this was less of an immediate issue.
At the moment, from my understanding from Basque Game Wildlife Conservation Trust, is obviously we're moving away from using lead shotgun ammunition. Obviously, rifle ammunition is another potential source of lead, but one that's potentially more controllable, because the main risk of exposure to rifle ammunition for birds is from what I would term mismanagement of gralloch material and mismanagement of quarry. And for me, that is leaving quarry in the field, leaving items of gralloch or of pluck that could then get into contact with wild birds. So for for hunters that shoot deer, for example, simple steps such as burying the gralloch and managing any potentially lead contaminated tissue effectively, I think is really important and will prevent any unnecessary toxicities.
So in the interim, when it comes to rifle ammunition, we have the chance now, given how the awareness has been raised of the issues of lead in the environment and how they affect wildlife, to put in place new best practice guidance with the use of lead-based rifle ammunition in a way that maybe we won't need to see a full phasing out? Do you think it potentially is enough to just change how we act in the field when it comes to shooting lead in rifles?
Absolutely. I think rifle shooting is, there's far less, or there's very minimal environmental contamination of lead with rifle shooting when it's being used as a tool for hunting. So therefore, it's just the management of the gralloch, of waste product, and not being irresponsible with how that's done. And if that is done, then hopefully the need to phase out lead rifle ammunition won't be there in the same way that it is to phase out lead shotgun ammunition, because it's the shotgun ammunition at the moment which I see is far harder to manage, because there is just so much more environmental contamination, whereas with the rifle ammunition that's not the case. You can control where that ends up and where that goes much more effectively.
Before I wrapped up my conversation with Tom, I wanted to paint a clearer picture of just how much lead is required to cause a problem. I was shocked by what he had to say.
So when you're talking about sort of toxic doses, so how much lead do actually animals need to ingest, this has been something that lots of people have tried to research, what actually is a toxic dose of lead to animals, and various numbers have been put forward. For examples, a chronic exposure of 2 milligrams per kilo of lead per day. So for your average mallard, that's not much more than a 50th of a number 6 shot. So you're talking very small amounts of lead over a chronic period of time will cause toxicity. For eagles, a number that's been put forward is 40 milligrams per kilo of eagle of lead as a toxic dose. So if your average eagle's weighing 3-5 kilos, you're only talking about a couple of number 6 shot as a potentially toxic dose. So you're not talking about massive ingestion over huge periods of time. You're talking about relatively small amounts of lead can have a real severe knock-on effect.
Now that is interesting. The bottom line is, when it comes to the science and what we understand today, it is unequivocal. We understand that lead toxicity leads to the death of animals.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that's been proven, and it's seen time and time again. And if you speak to any vet who treats particularly wild birds, they will say the same thing. They see cases day on day, and they're avoidable cases.
So the question is, how do we get this information across to the shooting community? I put this to Roy. Do you think that we need to disseminate the science that exists with regard to the toxicity burden in wildlife better? Or do you think we've done a poor job of that, and that is the underlying reason why there are a fairly large proportion of the shooting community in the UK that are resistant to this change and shift because they don't fully understand the impact of their actions?
I think partially they don't fully understand. It may be also that they don't want to understand, because I'm the same as many other people. The thought of having to change something that I'm happy with, I know how it works. I'm happy with my lead. I know where I'm shooting. I know what I'm doing with it. The thought of then having to change over and practice again and go through the process of maybe relearning your leads a little bit, maybe adjusting how high you're shooting your birds, and relearning those capabilities is something that, after I've been shooting my whole life since I was a small boy, and I'm in my mid-40s now, is something that I don't relish, but it's something that we're going to have to face, and we're going to have to overcome. And I think that's really where it stems from. Is people are happy with what they've got, and nobody likes change.
As Roy points out, this shift away from lead will mean a change for shooting in the UK, but we will not be alone. Many countries around the world have already moved away from lead, and as vintage gun dealer Diggory Haddoke discussed with me, we can learn from this.
Correct. Now, we can look at the experiences of countries like Denmark, Holland, Sweden, Norway, Belgium, places where lead bans were introduced. So I take on board the fact that Norway removed their ban on lead shot recently, but all the others have maintained it. Some of them, I know shooters in Denmark and Belgium and Holland who've been shooting for years with steel shot in Old English guns. And funnily enough, even Gamebore produce a 67mm cased, 2.5 inch chamber friendly steel shot cartridge, which they sell in Denmark, but they don't sell in England. Here in the UK, you can only buy 70mm, even standard steel shot cartridges. Now, the question about the efficiency of these various metals as projectiles, there is no doubt at all that lead is the best projectile if you're looking at it purely from a ballistic point of view. If you add in the ease of making lead into perfect spheres using the shot drop tower, and you look at the capacity that lead has to hold energy downrange, also its malleability when it hits a target to expand on impact and impart its energy into the bird rather than passing right through it. That produces clean kills because you don't want your shot to go right through your quarry. You want it to stay there and shock it to death rather than inflict a lethal wound that will make it fall down and die 200 or 300 yards from where you're standing, where it's hard to retrieve. So, no, ballistically, lead is the best ammunition, which is why we've used it for 200 or 300 years. But that's no longer the only consideration. So we have to look at the ballistics, and we'll have to do a lot more ballistic testing, because if we look at the ballistic data available to us that goes right back through shotgunning, it's all been done with lead. It's all been looking at how powders push lead. It's been looked at how you obdurate lead going down barrels. It's looked at the crushing effect of the pressure on the bottom of the shot column, the effect of lead going through forcing cones from the chamber into the bore, the effect of lead going through choke cones from the bore into the choke section, the tendency of lead to spread out at different ranges, having gone through different chokes, having been pushed at different speeds, and the capability of lead in terms of holding up its penetration with a given shot size at given ranges, and the amount of spread you get with a given choke at a given range. We're going to have to throw all this in the bin and start again testing with steel, because in order to have equal energy carried at 40 yards, looking at a number 6 lead shot, you're going to need a number 4 steel shot. But a number 4 steel shot might be the same weight as a number 6 lead shot, but it's also bigger, so it will slow down faster because it beats more air resistance. But steel seems to pattern tighter for any given choke than lead does, because it doesn't deform. So when people talk about not using steel through a choke tighter than half because it may damage your barrels, well, we may actually be looking at data that suggests that a given ounce of steel going through a half choke is producing a tighter pattern than the same charge of lead going through a 3/4 choke. We need to do all this data, gather all this data and do this testing in order to come out with clear scientific results. And I think this is part of what the cartridge manufacturing industry have warned us about, that there's a lot of work ahead of us before we get to the point where we can say, look, if you're used to shooting lead, here's a full smorgasbord of alternative ammunition that you can pick this up instead of that, and know that you're basically getting the same performance. There's a lot of data that we need to pick up, but there's no doubt about it. The physics is there. Lead is the best projectile. Anecdotal evidence from hunters suggests that steel can be effective, particularly within certain ranges, closer ranges, but the tendency of steel shot to pass through the birds can lead to more crippled birds falling, beyond your normal pickup range, and also birds that are shot within normal ranges, say within 25 yards, being smashed beyond what is palatable to eat because the steel pattern's that much tighter and smashes the meat up. So there are definitely problems with steel. Of course, the closest equivalent to lead is bismuth, which is only marginally lighter than lead. And I think on a density scale, lead's around 11 and a bit, and bismuth 9.5 or something, whereas steel is about 7.5. So you go up one pellet size of bismuth. Bismuth now alloyed with tin is fairly malleable and approximates lead in its behaviour. And you don't need to make any adjustments to your guns. You can swap over bismuth for lead and just carry on shooting. The downside of bismuth, of course, is that it's a pound a shot as opposed to about 32 pence for a premium lead cartridge.
This feels like the perfect time to hear from someone who lives in a country which has already enacted a lead ban. For this, I sought out a previous podcast guest and great friend of mine, David C.P. in Denmark, and asked him his opinion on the reaction to the lead phasing out in the UK.
First of all, in the times that we're in, I think it's interesting to stop just a second, and then all the stuff you said before about the lead ban, that most people understand it, some are quite vocal about it, it's too soon, it's the wrong way to do it. It kind of reminds me about the situation we are right now in with a global pandemic and how to handle another catastrophe. And it's a very normal way of reacting to a situation where the world is changing, is that most people will get it and we will have different ways of handling it. And some people will be extremely vocal and saying, well, why couldn't we just keep doing what we were doing? We were doing really well. So I think no, lead shot is not a global pandemic, but the discourse is the same. The way that we react is the same. The psychology is the same, that some people are against change and some people can see that we have to change in order to survive. And of course, it will cost something. It will be a problem for many people. But the alternative is worse. You also always have to look at the alternative. And that's what happened in Denmark. We are first movers when it comes to catastrophes these days. And the same thing, maybe we're just good planners. We saw this problem coming a mile away. And the whole debate was back then the same as we have right now, that lead shot in birds, in food, in nature, we need to get rid of it as much as we can. It's not healthy. It's refined lead that you used in shotguns, shotgun ammunition, or that we used to use. There's no way that's healthy. And if there is a better alternative, then we should try to use that alternative. And that was the whole discussion back then. And people said, you can't kill anything with steel, and it's too light, and it doesn't work. The exact same things that you have, the same discussions that you have in the UK right now. And lo and behold, there are still people in Denmark saying that it was much better with lead and it killed a lot better. Nobody really remembers why. And you I think you can kind of imagine the age group of people who thinks that lead was better.
So, given that the Danes have lived with a lead ban for so many years, I wondered what we can learn from how they adapted their shooting. David and I dug into this a little bit more. When I was speaking to Diggory earlier, just before I got on the phone to you, he was explaining of the need to re-educate in the type of shots that you take and how you use steel shotgun cartridges. Everything from the actual size of shot that you're using for hunting, to the size of chokes that you're using, to potentially the range that it is effective in. This is all knowledge that you guys have lived through, and you know that it's possible. And I was saying to him that I think one of the biggest things with this is going to be this process of re-education and understanding what's possible. And it might mean that you can't do things that maybe you used to do. Maybe you can't shoot super high birds anymore. I mean, there's a question of whether you should have been in the first place.
But give me 10 hunters and make them tell me how do they shoot a bird. They will all shoot it 10, maybe 12, maybe 15 different ways, because some of them don't really think about what they're doing and then doing it another way, and they've been told that they should do this, but they're actually doing this. We always improve as hunters. We always learn. That's who we are. We always have these ideas. And if you told someone 2 years ago saying, "Hey, dude, I can teach you to shoot better with your shotgun. Here's some awesome cartridges and here's a new choke." That's really cool. They do it. We shoot really well. That's really nice. What is this? It's steel and it's this choke. Okay, that's cool. But if you tell them that you're not allowed to use what you used to use, you have to use this. That's a different story. It's that the fact that we have to shoot in a different way. Then some years the barrels have to be X amount of inches. Other years it has to be Y amount of inches. We keep changing anyway. The whole thing about changing chokes, I have to admit, I have never changed chokes on my shotguns ever. Never, ever, ever. I do not give a shit. And the reason is, if I just shoot my shotgun and I practice at the ranges where I want to shoot, it works quite well. And if you're that kind of hunter who really enjoys changing chokes and measuring it out and doing all the nerdy stuff, more power to you. It's bloody awesome. Have a great time, and you'll have an even better time trying to figure out how to get the perfect spread and the perfect this and the perfect that with your steel shot, because you enjoy doing it. There's the reason why you do it. I don't enjoy changing chokes. I don't enjoy that little nerdy detail. So I don't do it, and it works really well. It's fine. But if you are a competition shot, of course you have to do it, but you do it anyway. There's absolutely no difference in the way that you act today and the way that you act tomorrow. If you change from lead to steel, you'll just have another excuse to tell your wife or your husband or your spouse, "I'm sorry, I have to go to the shooting range. I really have to practice this. The government told me to do it."
Hopefully, David has made shooters feel a little bit better about a future without lead. But how will the industry adapt to this phasing out? And what do new steel cartridges mean for old guns? There is no better person to answer this question than Diggory.
Yeah, there are going to be two things. There's going to be new guns where manufacturers are going, both gun manufacturers and cartridge manufacturers will need to be saying, look, if you want to go and shoot ducks or pheasants or partridges, here's our new gun, which we're producing for you to shoot these things with steel. And the cartridge manufacturers will be able to say, look, if you team this gun up with these cartridges for this kind of shooting, they'll be a good team, and they'll work out what it is that performs well on partridges at 30 yards or pheasants at 40 yards or ducks at 50 yards. The problem comes with existing guns, and particularly with older guns, because you're then having to reverse engineer in a way. You'll be having to try to find ammunition which you can experiment with to work in guns that were designed to be used with lead, and you may have to adjust your guns that were designed for use with lead to be more comfortable shooting steel. Now, with older British guns, that's a real problem because there's massive variation in a lot of older guns in terms of they can have steep forcing cones, which isn't good for steel. They can be very tight in the bore. I mean, 0.729 of an inch is your standard 12 bore size, whereas a lot of Victorian guns were made with guns that were 0.719 or 0.710 in the bore. And then you've got your choke, which would act off the bore and be a further constriction. You've also got the fact that a lot of old English guns have been lapped out to remove pitting, so they may be wider in the bore. They may not be concentric in the bore anymore. They may have pits, they may have rivels, they may have bulges. All of these things are unknowns in terms of how they will react with a closed cup wad of fairly immalleable steel going through it, and what sort of effect that will have on the gun. Now, the advice being given by the proof houses via the Gun Trade Association at the moment is, I think, rushed, and I also think slightly problematic, although I understand what they're trying to do. They're trying to be helpful. But the system we have of proof is what it says on the tin. You have to prove that a gun you want to sell is safe to shoot with a certain load. But what the proof houses seem to be saying now is that if you have a 70mm chambered English gun, which is standard 70mm nitro proof, post 1954, and the barrels are, quote, in good condition, you should be able to shoot standard steel, not superior steel, loads in it. Now, this isn't proof, this is supposition, because these guns have not been tested with steel loads. So the whole concept of proof, which is you must prove that your gun is safe with this ammunition, has been put aside for the first time since the 1600s.
Maybe you could expand a little bit on that, because one of the discussions that I've seen people had is when those who have supported this shift to phase out lead have highlighted other countries, as indeed you did earlier in our discussion. It is brought up that they have different rules with regard to proofing their guns and often operate at higher pressures be allowing the greater velocity of steel shot to be fired and make up for some of the pitfalls in potentially it being lighter ammunition, depending on how you've dropped down shot size. What is the reality of that? Or maybe you could just explain that to people who don't fully understand it.
Well, different countries are governed by different systems. So, for example, the Americans use a SAMI system, and we are linked to the CIP system, as are a number of countries. There are variations, although the whole point of it is that it's supposed to be leading towards standardization. I don't fully understand all the nuances of the differences between the two systems, but where it comes to a lot of the technology for new loads, they're working with new guns that are being superior steel proofed to much higher pressures than we're used to, for exactly the reason you said. They want to push this stuff faster to make up for its lightness in order to maintain momentum. Although the physics behind that is slightly problematic if you look at how it's worked on with lead. The long range loads that people used when they were developing efficient ballistics for lead was a relatively low velocity, slow burning powder, rather gently pushing the projectiles in order to maintain pattern and energy downrange. Quite a lot of tests showed back in the 1930s that if you push something too fast, you can blow the pattern. And also, if you push it too fast, it comes out of the muzzles very fast, but then the wind resistance to it slows it down, so that by the time you're out at 30 yards, it's actually not travelling very much faster than if you start it a couple of thousand feet per second slower. and it's not patterning as well. So it's more complex than you would think it is. And I'm not a proper ballistician. I mean, I've read a lot about it, but it's not my academic discipline. So there are better qualified people out there to talk about the forensic ballistics of these things than me. And perhaps some of the people at the cartridge companies who are at the cutting edge of this would be really worth sitting down with and talking through the science with them.
I wanted to ask Roy a little bit more about the environmental impact of lead, but it quickly took us away to an uncomfortable truth within the shooting community: the lack of compliance with current regulations limiting the use of lead ammunition. What other examples from around the world are there where this change and shift away from lead have already taken place on the back of negative consequences to the environment and wildlife? I mean, the California condor you've already mentioned is quite a good example, I suppose, of that.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of different studies, that are out there now on loons to ducks to all sorts of species that are being affected by lead, and I think this is something that again does need to be highlighted. It's not me harping on about raptors. I know raptors are not necessarily the closest thing to a shooting man's heart, but it is affecting a host of other wildlife. And again, there's certain studies out there that is probably worth publishing on the back of your podcast, so people can have a read through and have a look through. And I think that's another thing is although we've been required to shoot with non-toxic shot for wildfowling, etc. I do, and obviously you see it in the field. There is a lot of non-compliance, or has been a lot of non-compliance, and I think again, as a community, we shouldn't just shrug our shoulders with it. We need to embrace it and we need to tackle it.
This acknowledgement of the lack of compliance is not just coming from the shooting community. After praise for the lead phase-out announcement, Debbie Payne on Inside Science also highlighted this issue.
I think it's extremely welcome. I've been talking to shooting organisations for about 35 years now, and I've heard many times that the writing's on the wall for lead ammunition, but at least it is on the wall now and it's not in invisible ink, which is absolutely brilliant. So I really welcome that commitment. But one of the things that we really need is a proper plan and campaign to highlight the problem and the solution. So social science shows that we're very unlikely to have the commitment of the shooting organisations delivered unless we have that proper campaign. And sadly, it's been shown many, many times that voluntary agreements and partial regulations against the use of lead ammunition, lead gunshot or other types of ammunition aren't effective. So even with the 1999 ban for shooting wildfowl in England, there was a voluntary ban in advance, and that didn't work, which is why regulation was introduced. The regulation we now have is only partial. It's only for some species in some places, and that doesn't work. Whereas in Denmark, where there is regulation for all shooting using lead gunshot, there's incredibly high compliance.
Always a man to say it as it is. I asked David in Denmark what he thinks of this attitude. What would you say to the shooting community who look or view this ban as, well, you know what, screw you, I'm going to carry on doing what I've always done?
Let me put it into perspective. Right now, I'm in the middle of a nationwide curfew in Denmark because of some stupid virus that is caused by people who are sick or who thought that they weren't sick, who traveled anyway, who broke curfew, who did stupid things. Even though they knew that everybody said, no, you're not allowed to do it, they did it anyway. And what we're looking at right now is we had a voluntary curfew, and because people kept hanging out in cafes and parks and going to parties and playing beer pong, we will probably have a nationwide lockdown like they had in Italy, because some people don't understand that the reason why we make soft rules is because we expect you to not be assholes and actually live up to them. But if you don't live up to them, then we'll have to make stricter rules. And every single one of these guys who did not adhere to the law, it's actually your fault that the lead ban is coming. It's your fault. It's not the government. It's not Basque. It's not everybody else. It's your fault. There was a rule that said you should not do this, and you did it anyway. Then you have to make stricter rules. If people didn't use firearms for illegal purposes in Denmark, we would not have strict firearm laws. That's the reason why you can go down and buy a bow in any sporting goods store. You don't need a license. You don't need anything. You can buy a bow that can shoot an elephant. You can shoot through a car. You can buy sharp arrowheads, because no one ever did a bank robbery with a hunting bow. The second somebody does something that's stupid, we're going to have a law that says you're not allowed to buy a hunting bow. That's the reason why you can't have a crossbow in Denmark. It's because some asshole shot his lover with a crossbow. So if you sit out there right now, if you listen to this and say, well, this guy's wrong and I'm allowed to do this, you brought this on yourself, dude. This is all you. You owe everybody else a beer. And the only thing is that we still get, I have to question a little bit, is that we still get, when you have scannings of birds in Denmark, sometimes they say, but we found lead. Water birds don't necessarily live in the same country. They will also fly over different countries, and different countries have different hunting seasons. So a goose somebody took a pot shot at a goose in Russia, and somebody killed it in Denmark, and it's scanned, and there's half lead, half steel. That will mess up our statistics. So that's something that we're struggling with
to point out.
Yeah, it's something that we have to think about. But honestly, if it's in 90% of the birds that you scan, unless you have a lot of Russians in your backyard, it's probably not all of them.
I don't know if we have any Russian listeners, but if we do, we might get some complaints now that we're suggesting that they're the ones pumping birds.
And guys, I'm sure that if Russians go to Scotland and shoot, I'm sure you adhere to all the rules and you keep it tight. It's just the fact that you can use lead in Russia. So they're not doing anything illegal. There's nothing wrong with what the Russians are doing according to Russian law.
Now that we have a Danish perspective, I wanted to know what Roy's opinion was and how we can ensure a paradigm shift in attitude. How do we make sure that with the voluntary agreement and drive that we currently have to phase it out, that people actually take this on board? Because clearly, even though we have very strict and defined laws right now, people are not abiding by them.
No, and I think the only way that we can do that is through education. Is through education, and with the shooting groups, the shooting communities wanting to embrace it and wanting to do their bit, wanting to push forward with a conservation hat on. And I think, that is really, for me, it's nonsensical not to, because everything that we do is about preserving or trying to preserve our quarry species, trying to preserve the habitats that our quarry species live within, and trying to preserve the rest of the flora and fauna that benefit as a result of that. And I, even if I wasn't from a shooting background, then I would still see the major benefits that shooting give. With the cover strips, with the margins that are available, and with if you go into a cover, if you go into wood, if you go into a cover strip, then the amount of wildlife there compared to just a piece of agricultural land or a bare piece of agricultural ground, it's chalk and cheese. It's light and day. The differences. So again, these are the things that we need to embrace. These are the things that we need to push forward with, and we do need to put our conservation hats on. And I just hope that if we can allow people the understanding and people come on board, then it's not going to be a case of forcing people to do it. It's going to be a case that everybody's going to want to do it, and it will be seen to be within our ranks if somebody's not going forward and not doing the right thing, then people within through peer pressure, they're going to feel that they need to do so. And I think really that's the only way it's going to happen.
Diggory had something to add to this, pointing the finger quite firmly in one direction.
And I think the non-compliance of quite a lot of commercial duck shoots in the existing lead ban for shooting ducks in England and Wales, or for shooting over wetlands in Scotland, indicates that there's probably not a great deal of appetite among the authorities for accepting that shooters are a self-governing, law-abiding community. 70% of ducks tested in England for discovery of what they were shot with show that they were shot with lead, despite the fact that being illegal. And I think 20 years of non-compliance has brought by particularly, I think, commercial duck shoots, where you've got people paying significantly less to shoot 300 ducks than they would pay to shoot 300 pheasants, and approaching it with that mindset. They're also too mean to buy the expensive ammunition to shoot them with, and assuming that it will be somebody else's problem. Well, I've been telling people for 20 years that this will become all our problem, and now it is.
There is no question that those who have supported the phasing out of lead have taken considerable criticism across the industry. As a very public figure, I wanted to know from Roy how he felt about the response. As somebody who is clearly supportive of this change away from lead, and you're someone who has, particularly in the UK field sports community, you're someone that has, I was going to say a recognizable face and voice, because you're on Field Sports Channel, quite frequently. What has been the biggest criticism to you that you've felt from the shooting community? I mean, I've taken a little bit of that as well, because I sit with you on this. In fact, we have discussed this around the table at Glenogle. I think over the last 2 years, the use of lead has come up, but it wasn't, quite as in the public domain as it has been in the last few weeks. Where have the criticisms been pointed with regard to your viewpoint on it?
From going out there and now sort of heading in the direction that we are heading, and coming out and with certain viewpoints in the public domain. It's not something new for me. I mean, I've been trying non-toxic rifle ammunition for some time, and it's something that I'm very keen to champion and push forward as well. Although we're not, with what we're talking about at the moment, is not affecting rifle ammunition. I mean, personally, I would like to see a push from our shooting organisations and from our general shooting communities to going forward and using lead-free or non-toxic rifle ammunition as well. So it's something that I think people have been aware of, that it's something that I've been keen on for some time. But it's actually surprised me just how much opposition from our own ranks there has been to changing over. And it's quite shocking reading some of the comments and seeing some of the viewpoints that are out there. And a little bit disappointing, to be fair, because I would have hoped that everybody involved within the shooting communities, within the shooting sports, within the hunting shooting communities, would be embracing anything that can improve our public face, that can improve conservation. But it just seems at the moment that there's so many people there that are so entrenched and ensconced with their viewpoints that they're not willing to open up to the science and to accept the reasons behind it. And I think we can't be like that. We are the world we are living in is a very different place than we were 10 years ago, 20 years ago. It's changing rapidly with media, with social media as well. People's opinions can be manipulated very, very quickly by those are detractors, which they are, and we are going to have to be more reactive as a community. We can't rest on our laurels. We can't just sit back on our traditional high seats, and not as in high seats sitting
I
there.
get you. Yeah.
We can't just sit back and just let things carry on. We have to. I think we need to push forward. We need to be a lot more proactive with showing and sharing what we do. Which is again what we've been doing with the field sports, and you've been doing as well, for the past few years. So it's something that we're trying to push forward with. But I just think that it's a shame when the whole community is not embracing it for a positive.
What do you say to those loud voices which are trying to suggest that this could be the end of shooting, and by that, what is cited is the fact that the ammunition manufacturers simply can't supply the demand?
I honestly, it's the same as any commerce, any business. If you want to survive, then you've got to adapt and change. Unfortunately, if it's the case that the companies out there are not able to, there will be other companies and there will be other manufacturers out there that will come up and produce for us. So, it's going to be it may be a painful change, it may be an expensive change, but without change, I can't see a future for us anyway. We are going to have to be very, very careful with what we do. And I think we're going to have to ensure that future generations are able to go out and enjoy shooting and able to go out and enjoy hunting. These are the slightly painful decisions that we're going to have to make and adopt now. Because let's be truthful about this. If we don't adopt these changes, and if we don't look forward, and if we don't start adjusting our mindset a little bit, these changes are going to happen, but we're not going to have any control of them. They will just be enforced upon us.
David CP also has a few things to say about the mindset of hunters.
And the nice thing about the gun industry is that if there is a market, if there is a demand, there will be a supply.
Yeah, that's my opinion of it.
And if there isn't a demand, they will create the demand by creating some fun new caliber that we all really want. I don't think anybody really complained that. Just as a thought example, we were talking about that you had to change your chokes. You have to think about your shot in a different way. If I came and told you, okay, I made this awesome caliber, let's just call it a 6.5 Creedmoor. You know what's going to happen? You're going to buy a new barrel. You're going to go out and check the ballistics. You're going to learn how to shoot it, and you're going to enjoy it all the way. That's because that's who we are. We enjoy a new challenge. If I told you that you were only allowed to shoot this new caliber called 6.5 Creedmoor, then you'd be like, me, and I don't want to do that, and I want to shoot my old caliber, and it's much better. But honestly, it's just funny that's the psychology of these things, and that's what I've been talking about this whole session. Is it's all about the psychology of group thinking and how we think as hunters and as pretty conservative people. And I understand that and respect that.
I am not in the slightest bit concerned about the primary debate which has happened in the last few weeks, which is, well, we won't have enough cartridges if we're due to phase it out in the next 5 years, and the cartridge manufacturers are saying they can't do it. Because as far as I'm concerned, the money will talk. And if the demand's there, they will find a way, because guess what? They won't have a business.
5 years ago, people said, there will never be enough electrical cars. We will never do it. It's never going to happen. There's never going to be enough electrical cars. We can never make a self-driving car. We can never do this. You will never have an electrical car that actually looks like something that you want to buy. Now, there's not a single one of the big ones who hasn't come up with 5 or 6 models that they probably had in their drawer anyway, because the business of business is business. And if you are in the business of making things that go boom, then that's what you do. And then you do something else, you change your presses, you change your machines, you make your investment and you produce something more, or you go out of business. That's it. And if you don't believe me, then look at the gun industry in Europe. Some decided that you had the classic British guns. It was beautiful. They were great handiwork. Some of them survived by changing with the times. Some of them didn't. But you can still buy a British-made shotgun today, even though it makes absolutely no sense from an economical point of view. But they're beautiful.
You're not doing it for economics.
No, you're doing it because you can, and because it's great, and because you own a piece of art. It's not logic, but it's amazing and it's fantastic. But if you can produce a shotgun in Britain at those prices, there will probably be people around who also think, well, we can probably produce shotgun shells in that number as well, because that's not as hard. It really isn't. It's just a question of numbers.
Let's jump back now into the conversation with Roy. When the statement first came out, my public reaction in a tweet that I put out was, for the first time that I can remember, where we had taken an uncomfortable proactive approach. And I say uncomfortable because of all the reasons that we've been discussing, is that this wasn't going to be a universally popular decision, because it is going to involve change. But it was an example of looking at the future and where that is traveling and taking steps to mitigate potentially severely damaging implications of having legislation forced upon us.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think this is where people are struggling with at the moment, because we are doing it, and I think the organisation's thoughts behind this are they're doing it in as a painless a way as possible. I know a lot of people are really objecting because they didn't get consulted on it, but at the end of the day, what would the consultation have done? We would have just faced exactly the same comments that we're seeing now, and we would have procrastinated further. If we procrastinated further as a community, then again we would have had exactly that. It would have been forced upon us. That it's not a case that we just want to give it up. We're not throwing ourselves under the bus here. We're trying to divert away from having legislation enacted upon us. So I really don't understand where there is so much opposition and so much foot stamping going on, for want of a better word. And we need to grow up a little bit and move forward with it.
Yeah, it's interesting. It was something that I had discussed with somebody, a week or two ago when we were talking about the politics behind this, which was, as you highlighted, this potentially, because I don't have the full details, because I'm not on any of these committees of any of the organizations that brought forward this suggestion, nor am I particularly well connected with the high levels of the cartridge companies, but we were discussing the politics of the behind-the-scenes consultations prior to the announcement. And I was pretty much of the same opinion, which was that, ultimately, it seems like there's been very poor communication. But what would have been the outcome of a more across-the-board approach to this discussion? I honestly believe that the only outcome was that we may not have seen this advice and drive towards phasing out of lead for a year, 2 years,
Exactly.
3 years, 5 years, 10 years. Who freaking knows? Because one thing that you can guarantee is that those businesses would not want to change, because it's going to require massive capital investment. And like you said, those that will step up and supply the demand, they will take the market. And those that don't want to, they will die out and fade into the list of companies who historically made cartridges. And you know what? That's free markets.
No, exactly. I mean, it's evolution, isn't it? If you can't keep up, then somebody else is going to surpass you. And unfortunately, it is as simple as that. But it is. There are so many problems facing shooting, going forward. We need to be a lot more, as I say, proactive. We need to tackle these things head on, and we need to have grown up discussions about them. And as you say, I think if it had gone to discussion and people would have said, oh, we need longer, we need this, we need, and we would have just been sitting milling around. So at least we've given ourselves a deadline. And again, it's the other thing that to remember with this is, this is voluntary. This is something that we're going forward as a positive. So it's, we are giving ourselves the opportunity to do this. We're giving the communities a chance to adapt, to change, to figure out how we're going to do it. And 5 years is a long time.
It is.
5 years is a very, very long time.
Hopefully we'll be out of lockdown by then.
Well, fingers crossed. Exactly. Well, if not, then
we'll have other problems on our plate.
But no, it's, and I think most of the opposition from what I've seen is definitely coming from the high pheasant boys. And there are.
I'm unpopular for suggesting that very thing.
Sorry,
I said I'm unpopular for suggesting that very thing.
Well, exactly, but it is, from what I've seen on social media, there's a lot of opposition from that. And don't get me wrong, there's nothing finer than going out and seeing some beautifully presented birds. If you've got to make some adjustment to that, or your cartridges are going to cost you a little bit more for some of the non-toxic alternatives, it's negligible compared to the cost that you're paying for the day. We're not talking about breaking the bank. At the end of the day, if we want to be able to pursue that specific side of the sport, then we're going to have to adapt to it, and we're going to have to figure out how we can do it.
Diggory Haddoke again.
And from my point of view, I'm looking at it now from a pragmatic point of view. It's terrible for my business. I deal in guns that can't shoot steel shot, really. People like me, people who deal in old English stuff, are now looking at a potential reduction in the value and the attractiveness of those things to market. If you can't shoot them, or you're unprepared to bear the cost of shooting bismuth, or you think that the potential people in the market who will buy this stuff are unprepared to consider English guns in future because of the perceived problems with ammunition, that could have a domino effect on the value in the market of all these guns that we love and cherish and make a living out of. I think in some respects, people like me, although I realise that we're a small sector, are probably the worst affected by a potential lead shot ban than anybody else in the shooting sector. But there's no point having a hissy fit about it. If the world is moving in that direction, what we need to do is say, right, well, then what are we going to do about it? What are our options? And that's why we need to start looking at the potential of steel shot to be used in older English guns and developing ammunition that works. I think we need to look at the cost of bismuth. And I think for your average shooter, it's not as bad as people think. If bismuth is £1 a shot, if you shoot 200 bird days with an average shot to kill cartridge ratio of 4:1, I think you can, if you perhaps then average out, if you're in a team of 8 guns, that you'll be shooting 100 cartridges that day. If you were shooting lead, it would cost you £35 in ammunition for the day. If you're shooting bismuth, it'll cost you £100 for ammunition. Now, that sounds like a big deal because you're essentially tripling the cost of your ammunition. But you're putting it in the context of a day that probably cost you £38 a bird. So you drove there in your Range Rover at 80 miles at 17 miles to the gallon and gave the keeper a £50 tip. You're talking about a day that's probably cost you £1,000 or £1,200. So adding £60 to the cost of your day isn't enormous. And I think a lot of the talk about it being, becoming economically impossible to carry on shooting if you have to go over to bismuth isn't really borne out by the analysis of the real costs of shooting. I think if you're shooting big numbers, and the people that have been most vocal in opposing this have been the people that shoot extreme pheasants in inverted commas, and people who shoot very big commercial days. Now, one chap told me that his cartridge bill would go up from sort of £7,000 or £8,000 a year to £30,000 a year if he swapped over to bismuth. Well, that's because he's shooting 25 to 30,000 cartridges at game every year. And frankly, if you can afford to shoot 25 or 30,000 cartridges at game every year, although £30,000 in ammunition sounds horrific to average mortals like myself, well, if I was to look at his overall shooting bill for the year, it's still no bigger a proportion of it than the extra £100 a day that would go onto mine looking at my shooting expenses for the year. So I think people need to get a grip. It may be that you have to drop the number of birds you shoot. It may be that shoots have to start changing the way they present birds to make them sporting without necessarily thinking the only way to present sporting birds is that they're at 70 yards. This is a relatively new phenomenon. And I think if we are trying to tell the layman and the non-shooting public that we're conservationists, when we then come back very aggressively telling people that we're not prepared to compromise on lead shot because we insist on shooting pheasants at 70 yards, well, our conservation credentials crumble pretty quickly, in my opinion.
Diggory also highlighted a potential benefit in self-interest to taking a proactive approach.
I think what we're seeing here is that shooting organisations perhaps taking a medium-term view and saying, look, if we do nothing, in 4 or 5 years' time, we may well have legislation dropped on us from a great height and not be able to contribute in any meaningful way. Whereas if we enter into dialogue now with stated intentions of a voluntary removal of lead, if the industries connected with providing ammunition and guns and shooting can make it so that transition is as painless as possible, now that sends out a good signal to the neutrals, if you like, in government to say, well, perhaps you don't need to come down with draconian legislation, because if over the next 5 years we can come back to you and say, look, we've reduced the use of lead as shotgun ammunition by providing alternatives to 85% of what it was in 2020, you don't really have a problem on a magnitude that's worth legislating against anymore, do you? And it may well be that the government take the view that 85% compliance is good enough, which would leave scope for some exemptions, in the way that when lead-free fuel was imposed on the motoring industry, they back in 2000 they allowed for an exemption of 0.5% or 0.2%. I'm working from memory of fuel sales to be leaded petrol, which are sold only through affiliated clubs of vintage motoring organisations, so that if you do happen to run a vintage car that requires leaded fuel and can't be adjusted to take unleaded fuel, then you can still run it. But the fact that so few of those things are putting lead into the air that it actually is now inconsequential has allowed for that exemption. And I would hope to see us making a case for a similar exemption for vintage British guns, which have 2.5-inch chambers and Damascus barrels, and for various historic reasons are not readily adjustable to take economic non-lead alternatives. But the fact there are so few people shooting Old English guns at game that the number of pellets hitting the ground as a result of them continuing to use them would be so small as to be of no consequence, environmentally speaking.
With all this discussion, there is one giant elephant in the room. What about plastic contamination from shotgun shells? One of the other elements to this discussion that is brought up is that, well, not only are we not ready in terms of supplying steel shot, and we've just talked about that. I think we're both in agreement that markets will find a way to deliver it. But the second part of that is that we've only very, very recently been able to load steel shot with biodegradable plastic wads. Now, I personally, obviously, I shoot steel as per the regulations. So when I shoot on the foreshore, I'm shooting steel. But when I'm roughed up shooting up here in Scotland, I'm shooting lead out my 20 bore. But I have, for as long as I can remember, shot fiber wads because I never liked the idea of firing plastic out over the fields and hills. Where do you where do you sit on that? Because as it stands right now, people could shift, but we don't. It's not a universal approach with regard to biodegradable wads from all the manufacturers who produce steel.
No, I mean, this is it, and it's we don't want to be polluting, and again, we can't be seen to be polluting. So again, we've got to push forward and use what's best for our environment, and what we'd be happy to see scattered behind us. I mean, this is the thing, isn't it? We don't. We need to ensure that environment is in as pristine a condition, if not better, than when we stepped up on it. So as far as I'm concerned, I mean, I'm going to really make a push now in the next couple of years to go out and shoot, go out and practice, get out on the playgrounds with a lot more of the steel alternatives. Just work with it a little bit more. Just see where we are. I mean, I don't do anywhere near the amount of game shooting now as I used to, but I still do enjoy a few days every season. And I want to be using lead-free alternatives, and I think that's what we need to do. We just need to get out there, get on the playgrounds, go and have a play, and just figure it out again. Just see where we are.
It is amazing how innovation develops when industry is forced to do so. So with regard to biodegradable cups for steel, obviously we've already seen some very recent innovation with regard to that. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's from Ely, and the plastic wad dissolves in water in 24 hours or 48 hours. And I know that there's some other technologies and research going on right now. It will happen, and it will happen very quickly. And I think that anybody that thinks that it won't, I'm not sure whether they fully appreciate the drive for people to make money, because ultimately that will drive the innovation.
Exactly. No, and that is it in a nutshell. If we are finding ourselves in a position where we are going to have to start using these alternatives, then the money will be there, or the incentives will be there for the manufacturers to go forward to make these products for us and to ensure that they are available for us. And I know that the cartridge manufacturers are feeling it at the moment, and are certainly not going to be embracing our words at the moment. But it is going to be a painful change. But hopefully going forward, they're going to come out of it with a fine product that fits the bill. And again, I think it's because we just within field sports, we always hark back to tradition, or we hark back to this is what we've always done. In this day and age, we just can't do it. And I realise there are going to be another big aspect of people's objections were. We're not going to be able to use our old, side-by-sides, our old traditional shotguns or whatever else. And unfortunately, again, that for some of those guns, then yes, they're not going to be able to be used. That is a shame, but unfortunately, that is just part of the process. It's not going to be painless. But same as with all change, we've got to go through it.
Thanks very much for listening to this quite complicated topic, but one that is incredibly important. Join me again in a week's time where we take another walk into the wilderness.